Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
And look, I just want to say enormous credit to Sharri Markson. She is a journalist, an incredibly professional one, but she's also a Jewish Australian. So this comes with a huge toll on her personally, and I think she's done a terrific job. All right, let's get into the show tonight. Here's what's coming up on Credlin. We're still 2 days away now from referendum Saturday, but already some of the fallout for our largest corporates has begun. Shareholders revolting against the $1 million plus donations to the Yes cause, as it appears business well and truly misread the community mood. But as positive as the polls might be for the No campaign, and there's a final one, a YouGov poll I want to take you through tonight, it's no time to get complacent if you want to keep our constitution colourblind. Votes can still be lost this close to polling day. More on that risk shortly. Plus, the divide in Australia is growing even worse, with news today that Jewish students now feel under threat on university campuses, not just from the radical lefties, but also a very pro-Palestinian academia. I'll speak to a student on the front line of a university system that I reckon has lost its moral compass. And regardless of what the police or Premier Chris Minns has said, there are rallies planned, more hate rallies this weekend in Sydney. In the absence of Labor being tough enough, Peter Dutton has stepped up and called out anyone inciting anti-Semitism, demanding that officials must do more.
If they were non-citizens, and the police should be doing this work now, if they were non-citizens, they should be, their visas should be before the minister, and on character grounds, they should have their visas cancelled.
But first, with the polls as they are, there's still a risk of last-minute upset due to complacency, apathy, and the reluctance of some voters to run the gauntlet of a noisy Yes campaign. Now, people I know personally who've been standing on pre-polls over the past 2 weeks say they've never seen the sort of personal attacks they're witnessing in this referendum before. That's because the Yes camp are desperate. And they know that the harder you target individuals, the more moral pressure you pile on them, the more likely they will fold. Fold or stay away from the polling booths altogether and just not subject themselves to hectoring. But if you want to keep our constitution colourblind, well, you can't leave voting to others. Even if the No case looks like it will win, it has not yet won. Meaning if No supporters don't get out there in force, we still risk waking up on Sunday morning with some of us having more say than others over how our government works based on race and ancestry. Of course, one thing that the most recent polling has done is explode the Yes case myth that 80% of Aboriginal people support the voice. The latest Resolve poll, taken largely, of course, in New South Wales and Victoria, where sampling is easier, has just 60% Indigenous support for the voice, even though it's pitched as a great advance specifically for them. Indeed, it's testimony to their good sense and patriotism that so many Aboriginal people haven't bought the Yes line, that they've been ripped off by colonial events 2 centuries ago, and that only a constitutionally entrenched separatist voice can make things good. And as for the view that a No vote will somehow break people's hearts, sure, there will be disappointment either way, whatever happens on Saturday night, and frustration, of course, amongst Yes voters if it goes down. But it's better to have a few bad days than end up with a bad mistake permanently baked into our constitution. And as for the PM's threats, that the world will think worse of us if we vote No, those pro-terrorist scenes at the Opera House on Monday that took him far too long to condemn, well, I know that's damaged us more as a nation than any free democratic vote in a referendum ever could. So let me say this before the left try and rewrite the narrative should the Yes vote lose. There's no way a successful No vote should be taken as a rejection of Aboriginal people. It would actually be an affirmation that all of us, black, white and everyone else in between, should live and work together as equals, as Australians first and foremost, and not divided by our bloodlines. Especially when right now In image after horrific image, we've got the grim example of the hatreds that flow when everything is all about race. There have been few uglier spectacles than those anti-Semitic thugs out the front of the Opera House, all lit up in solidarity with Israel, spewing their bile and pro-terrorist propaganda, and those chants I never thought I'd hear again in my lifetime, gas the Jews. Now, they might not have been wearing Nazi uniforms, but they were certainly shouting race hate. And yet the police, who were so quick to crush lockdown protests with their riot squads and rubber bullets as we live through here week after week in Victoria, they did nothing to stop it. Indeed, shamefully, they facilitated it.
We were better to facilitate that march to the Sydney Opera House. They had a point of destination, undesirable for everyone, how it may have been, but we had no power, if we didn't facilitate that march, to stop people walking down there anyway.
That's official gutlessness. Enforce the law, Commander. But this is what happens when people see their fellow human beings only through the prism of race and try to undo history and try to resurrect land claims with talk of treaties that set us all against each other. That's always been one of the big flaws at the heart of this voice push, this view that the settlement of Australia was somehow illegitimate, and that to atone for this so-called sin, Aboriginal people had to be given special status with rights and privileges over and above those available to every other Australian. That's not how it should work in a democracy. For centuries, you can argue that women have suffered significant systemic disadvantage, but there's no talk of a voice to the parliament for women. And look, if there was, like quotas, I would oppose it just as strongly as I do now, because all of us must be equal, regardless of race, gender, sexuality or anything else, equal before the law and equal in our Constitution. Despite the PM's glib lines, the voice has never been about listening to Aboriginal people, because for the past 50 years, that's exactly what we've done. Indeed, there's hundreds and hundreds of Aboriginal bodies around the country spending taxpayer billions, but none of them taking responsibility that things haven't changed as much as we would like, despite all the money and the goodwill of Australians.
The Aboriginal industry feels threatened and want this transfer of power because for the first time in our history we're actually overrepresented in federal parliament, and there are those of us like myself and my colleague Senator Karen Little as well as Senator Thorpe who are questioning the status quo, who are questioning where the billions of dollars are going to year in, year out. We want to understand better where it has been going, where it's been misspent, misused, and holding to account, applying accountability for those who are responsible for improving the lives of our marginalised. I mean, let's face it, if we in fact were to get rid of the marginalisation, there are a lot of organisations, particularly right here in Central Australia and the Northern Territory, that would no longer be required to exist.
She nails it, doesn't she? I mean, too often it's the wrong Indigenous voices, the separatist voices, rather than the unity voices that have controlled the microphone and got the attention of our political leaders. Now, thank God that whatever the result on Saturday, I sense a real changing of the guard, and that's a good thing. But as positive as the polls might be, if you're saying yes to a united Australia by voting no to this divisive voice, it would be a mistake to take Saturday's result for granted or assume it's all over bar the shouting. This could easily be the political version of a game that's lost or won in the final minutes before the siren. But if the result is no, it certainly can't be business as usual, as I said in my column in The Australian today. Whatever the result, the problems of remote Australia, where so many Aboriginal people are doing it tough, they will have to be addressed. And an end to the excuses and the waste from politicians and the urban Indigenous elites. Kids must go to school, no excuses. If Aboriginal women and children are abused, then the full force of the law must be applied to the perpetrators, regardless of culture. And just like anyone else, the expectation must be that Aboriginal people have the dignity of work and not a life on welfare. As Noel Pearson used to say, welfare is the poison that is killing my people. And that it's the tyranny of low expectations, he said, that's at the heart of Indigenous disadvantage. On Saturday night, if the vote is no, it's not just a result rejecting the voice. It's also a rejection of a whole lot of other stuff that's crept in and stuff that implies that some of us are more Australian than others, and that too should all be done away with from Saturday. Like the constant acknowledgements of country as if this land belongs to some of us but not all of us. A welcome to country by Aboriginal people at an Aboriginal event, fine. But enough of the mindless repetition of empty words by speaker after speaker at public events and now even private work meetings, to the point that it's almost a farce. Like too, the constant flying of the Aboriginal flag alongside our one and only national flag, as if the flag of some of us should have equal standing to the flag of all of us. If the result is no, no one should be apologetic or feel the need to placate the activists behind the voice. Because no is a vote of confidence in Australia's future. A vote of no is a rejection of the revisionism and unbalanced shame about our past. What this week in Israel has shown me, and I suspect many other Australians, is that once you go down the path of race division, it is a path that takes us all backwards, not forwards, as one people. Once you go down that path, it's a path of no turning back. All right, let's get the headlines now. Quite a bit around. Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
Good evening. Opposition leader Peter Dutton is calling for those who attended the pro-Palestinian protest in Sydney on Monday night to be deported.
If there were people there who were on visas, they should be identified and they should be have their visas cancelled. They should be deported. People with that hate in their minds and their hearts don't have any place in our society.
The opposition leader moving to apply pressure on the government to do more in response to the protests that saw Israeli flags burned and anti-Semitic slurs chanted. The Palestinian Action Group described Mr Dutton's comments as a shocking attack on democratic rights. People have a right to protest against the war crimes and apartheid policies of the Israeli state, they said. It comes as the head of Australia's top domestic security agency, Mike Burgess, warned of the potential for opportunistic violence with little or no warning in Australia following Hamas's attack on Israel. He cautioned against provocative language, saying ASIO has seen direct connections between inflamed language and inflamed community tensions. The first evacuation flights out of Israel for Australians will begin tomorrow. 3 flights have been scheduled from Tel Aviv to London. The first will leave on Friday, a second on Sunday, and a third next week. The government is calling on Australian citizens who want to leave Israel to register with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade through the Smart Traveller website, so it can gauge how many flights it needs to organise. Countries like Hungary, Austria and Spain organised military planes early this week and have been evacuating citizens since Monday.
It seems like DFAT maybe are lacking a little bit of coordination, to be honest. They've been very kind and considerate, but in terms of being upfront with information, it's been quite frustrating.
The Albanese government has opted for the commercial option.
In terms of making sure we could get flights as quickly as we could, we looked at all options, including commercial options, and Qantas was able to assist.
Emotional footage of Australian journalist Chung Lei speaking with the Prime Minister has been released.
Hello, Prime Minister. What an honour. This is the...
I'm so pleased to be able to talk with you.
I'm honoured and pleased. I was telling Mr Wong that it's because of you and all the team at DFAT that I'm able to make it here in one piece.
Foreign Minister Penny Wong says she's thrilled Chung Lei has been released. She spent more than 3 years in a Chinese prison under murky charges.
Welcome home. Thank you. Well, it's very good to see you.
Well, we're almost there, aren't we? The referendum, of course, on Saturday, but the fallout, well, it's already started for many of those pro-voice corporates around the country. At the Commonwealth Bank's AGM yesterday, the bank's board was repeatedly berated by investors for supporting the PM's cause. One shareholder even demanded that the bank's board repay the donation from their own personal funds. Others questioned why the bank was willing to spend millions on the Voice campaign, but not on improving services for CommBank customers. All fair points, I reckon. Joining me now for this and the headlines, of course, Sky News senior reporter Credlin and former Liberal federal MP Nicole Flint. Welcome to you both. Nicole, I'll start with you if I can. Of the top 20 businesses listed on the ASX, 13, well, they have publicly supported the Voice. Many, of course, like the CommBank, have donated millions. Here was the chairman, Paul O'Malley, trying to justify the spending the other day.
We state clearly in our Reconciliation Action Plan that we will support more First Nations voices in forming First Nations solutions. Our support for reconciliation is long-standing and consistent with our focus on sustainable practices, policies and outcomes to create long-term value for our customers, communities and for our shareholders. For these reasons, we reached a view that the bank should be supportive of the Voice.
Nicole, surely shareholders are right to demand answers given the weight of public opinion is against the bank boards and this is shareholder money.
Precisely, Peter, and I'm with the shareholder who rightly demanded that the board or the executive, whoever made the decision to spend millions of dollars to support the Voice campaign, should have to fork out of their own pocket. Why on earth are shareholders paying for corporate advocacy, corporate woke advocacy? And Peter, honestly though, this is in the hands of the shareholders. They have the power to vote these people out, and that would send a very strong signal to any corporates planning to embark on any future left-leaning advocacy that they shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, it will be interesting, Nicole, to see this as the turning of the tide in the war against woke, where the shareholders now will get more vocal when they understand that there's a lot of community power behind them. In The Australian today, Carolina wrote about, I guess this week leading into the referendum, watching the whole issue of race play out, particularly those horrific scenes we saw in Sydney on Monday night. And to me, it was a really powerful reminder that the last thing we want to do on Saturday is to lock racial division into Australia's constitution. Now, I know you're a member of Australia's Jewish community. This has been deeply personal to you, hasn't it?
I think it has been deeply personal for every Jew in Australia, every Jew around the world. It's just been heartbreaking, horrifying, traumatising, and then compounding that trauma is the knowledge that there is still a fairly significant section of our society that tries to justify the mass slaughter of our people in our spiritual and Jewish homeland. And they not only minimise it and try and justify it, but there are people on our own streets who come out and celebrate it, and that our authorities give them the space to do that. That is what is especially troubling here, Peter. And, you know, in terms of the parallels with the Voice, well, you know, I know that there are members of the Jewish community who do oppose the Voice on principle for the reasons that they've seen how racial divisions in the communities that they've come from, that they've escaped from, has impacted their own communities. They don't want to see that happen here in Australia. You know, I was in court today for this case, this man, 23-year-old man who's been charged now with intimidating 4 Jewish boys, just children, with threatening allegedly to kill them after seeing an Israeli flag on their car. This is the first case of relating to anti-Semitism that we've seen since the Israel terror attack. He got bail today. Police didn't even oppose that bail. He has a prior conviction for a violent offence for common assault. We haven't seen any more arrests in relation to those protests, and it is just really troubling for members of the community not to feel safe on our own streets.
And not to feel the police are in your corner. I mean, we've got another protest planned for the weekend in Sydney again on Sunday. I'm not going to call it a pro-Palestinian rally. It's a pro-Hamas, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic rally. Let's call it what it is. The Premier says it's not going to happen. But the police say, well, we can't really do much about it. It is unauthorised. But they say, and I quote, we do not have the powers to stop people attending town hall. Nicole Flint, how weak is this?
It's really weak, Peter. And let's remind ourselves what happened on Monday night. The Opera House was lit up in sympathy and in solidarity with the Israelis, and for everyone touched by the horrendous terrorist attack that occurred in Israel. And then we had protesters turn up to protest against Israel and obviously against sympathy and solidarity for Israel. It is appalling. It is deeply un-Australian, Peter, and it shouldn't be tolerated. And I look back to the COVID period of time in Australia where governments could make very quick decisions when they wanted to about stopping people from protesting and enforcing the law or even passing new laws. Peter, why aren't we seeing that? Because, as I said, these are not just peaceful protests. These are people saying it's okay that innocent civilians were slaughtered, were murdered, were raped, have been taken hostage. It is completely unacceptable and we need to see a much stronger response.
And police say they can't stop these rallies, Peter, but let's not forget that on Monday night, one sole Jewish man turned up with an Israeli flag to express his solidarity in the city, and he was arrested by police. He was the only arrest by police. We brought you that story exclusively earlier this week. How can the only person that police can take action against be a Jewish person who's turning up to the city on the night that our most well-known landmark is being lit up in solidarity with the Jewish people, and he is the one that police arrest?
Because I'm sorry to say, we had, Black Lives Matter march against the rules in their thousands in Melbourne. Nothing happened to them, no arrests at all. And yet a poor woman put something up on Facebook about being against the lockdowns and she gets arrested in her pyjamas. That is the problem. Carolyn Marcus, Nicole Flint, thank you both for your time. Let's get into some of the polling detail. We're going to forecast a little bit into Saturday night. There's a lot of polls around. New polls out today too. Someone who knows his way around polls and campaigns here and overseas, Queensland LNP Senator James McGrath. Welcome, James McGrath. YouGov, this is what we're told their last poll before Saturday. It's got the No campaign now increasing its lead by 18 points. That's a walloping in the last few days. The No camp now is ahead 56% to Yes at 38%. Small undecided there at 6%. A lot of talk this week, James, that the Yes vote had bottomed out. But that poll says to me it's still falling.
It is still falling. But being a natural pessimist and being a Conservative from Queensland, it's not over till the fat lady sings. And I'm concerned about complacency amongst some of the No campaign on the ground who think they may have it won. I'm also concerned about that people may not turn up and vote on Saturday because they're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. They've got families to worry about. So the polls look good, but I'm not going to say anything until 6 p.m. on Saturday.
You must have heard my editorial. I have the same sort of worries. I've got worries about people voting informal, although I hope now that message about writing no and not crossing a box or anything like that has got through. But I'm talking to people on pre-polls. I know you've been out on pre-polls. They're saying they haven't seen the aggression that they're seeing now before. This is the Yes camp aggression. I mean, they're really targeting people as they get out of their cars, they walk up the steps and they're on their way to vote. Do you think that's also a risk, that people stay away because they just don't want to really engage in this fight?
That's correct. The aggression from the Yes campaign on the ground is disturbing. We've seen a lot of paid union activists across the state. I've driven from Serena up to Townsville. I've been out in pre-poll today between Jimboomba and here in Brisbane. And the Yes campaign just have this aggro about them, but it's aggro that's combined with this sanctimonious hypocrisy. And I think it is scaring away some people who are frightened about how that attitude is going to rub off. I'm going to say to those who are watching us tonight, ring them up. Don't message them. Ring up your friends and family and make sure they get out there and make sure they do write no on that ballot paper.
Yeah, and look, if you need to, go to the polling booth with others. I mean, there's always a sense of strength in numbers. Just walk past them, let them spew their bile, but you go in and have your say in our democracy in the usual way. What I found interesting, the polls that we saw at the top of the week, I think it was a Resolve poll, but certainly in that news poll, and this should be heart to any Conservative, but that demographic shift right across the board, including young people, now all saying or looking like they're going to vote no. What does, other than those few inner city electorates, it's also across the country broadly. What does that tell you for the Liberal Party, for the Coalition, for the LNP, about if you're prepared to have a fight with a bit of conviction, you might win it? And what does it say to Labor as well?
What it says to Labor, to begin with, is that they've just wasted hundreds of millions of dollars on a referendum that's going to fail, that could have been spent on bettering Aboriginal health and Aboriginal educational outcomes. But what it sends to my party is, yes, we've got to stand up for principle and conviction. We've got to make sure we get out there and campaign. We've got to make sure we get out there and are united as a team, which we are under Peter Dutton. We've got to get out there and make sure we represent our community and fight on those issues that people care about. And the number one issue out there, once the voice is over, is cost of living. And we need to make sure that Anthony Albanese owns this result and make sure that this Gough Whitlam wannabe knows that he's the one who has broken Australia, and we need to make sure that that is on every time that his name is mentioned in the media.
Yeah, well, just on the PM, let's say it goes down. I mean, it can't readily go out there and say, 65, maybe even 70% of Australians got it wrong. This is very much a personal rejection of his voice. It's his proposal. It's been all he's talked about to the exclusion of anything else for months now. How does he deal with this? What's the sort of fallout for him personally and politically, do you think?
Well, if he had the honour of David Cameron, he would resign. And I'll remind everybody that David Cameron, on the morning of the referendum in the UK, when the UK voted to leave the EU, David Cameron had campaigned strongly for the Remain side. His side lost. He resigned that morning on the steps of Downing Street. Now, I will bet you a lot of money that Anthony Albanese will not resign as Prime Minister. And I actually think he should look at David Cameron and take the honourable way out, because he is the one who has divided Australia and he is going to be a damaged Prime Minister.
James, if the voice goes down, surely there can be no Makarrata Commission. The money in the budget for a Makarrata Commission, which is set up to go down the path of treaty, if the first step, Noel Pearson calls it the first door, if that door doesn't get opened by the Australian public, surely all this talk of Makarrata, truth-telling and everything else that was meant to come after it, that's got to end.
It will have to end, because the message that the Australian people and the message that the Queenslanders are sending, and Queensland, I think there'll be a no vote above 60%, maybe closer to 70%. Parts of Queensland will be 80%, will be, let's come together as a country and unite as a country, regardless of our race, regardless of where we come from. And all this other business, and you mentioned it in your opening comments, about every time you go to a meeting, someone has to do a welcome to country, and it's driving people nuts. We should be looking at what unites us as a country, and I'd be calling upon the Labor Party and the Labor government to look at what unites us and put that money towards those possible expenditure items into Aboriginal health and Aboriginal education outcomes for those who live in remote, regional and rural Australia.
Senator McGrath, thank you. All right, after the break, we're going to get some expert insight in what is going to happen now as we've got hundreds of thousands of Israeli troops on the Gaza border. Greg Sheridan in a moment. Plus, we'll hear from a Jewish student in Australia who says they're being intimidated at university campuses, and it's not just left-wing students, it's academics as well. Coming up, the latest polling that shows support for Victorian Liberal leader John Pesutto as preferred Premier has fallen 13% since the departure of Daniel Andrews. Now, that's diabolical for all those Libs who thought the departure of Andrews put them back in the game. The fact is, voters still don't think they're up to the job, and that's got to change, and fast. But let's go now into a bit of a deep dive into the situation in Israel and, of course, the weekend's historic referendum vote. And who better than Greg Sheridan, Foreign Affairs Editor at The Australian, to do that with me now. Greg, thank you. I don't want to trawl over old ground, old and I say recent days ground. I want to focus, if we can, on what happens next. I can't imagine the choice that goes through the minds of government officials and intelligence agencies and the military at the moment. Hundreds of innocent civilians, Israelis in Gaza, yet the retribution must come for the terror attack that occurred last Sunday. And we've got all of those reservists called up, 300,000 of them now in the borderlands of Gaza, and of course some up the north near the Hezbollah border. Where do they go from now?
Well, Peter, it's good to be with you even in this week of darkness and madness. So Hamas killed about 1,200, a bit more than 1,200 Israelis, mostly civilians, the greatest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And Hamas really is a kind of Arab Nazi movement. It's a death cult. It's at the moment, the Israelis are continuing to bombard Gaza and to try to destroy and degrade Hamas's ability to wield large weapons systems. But I think there may be probably about 160 hostages in Gaza. The Israelis will certainly be conscious of the hostages and doing everything they can to rescue them. But I don't think the hostages will act as a shield for Hamas in Gaza. I think the Israelis will have to mount a ground invasion fairly soon, and their objective will be to destroy Hamas. So they will be wanting to eliminate the leadership of Hamas and to destroy Hamas as a movement. And whatever arrangement comes at the end of that, Hamas can't come back to power. It's likely to be a very bloody and bitter business because this is very densely populated urban warfare that we're going to see. Hamas loves death. It's prepared for this. This is what it wanted to happen. There'll be booby traps, IEDs, snipers, human suicide bombers, all the rest of it. This is going to be very ugly, but Israel has no alternative. Otherwise, the future survival of the state of Israel, I think, would be very hard.
And what about the broader geopolitical sort of consequences, the role that you see Iran has played here? What your take is on this whole idea that Israeli-Saudi Arabian sort of peace talks might have precipitated Iran's engagement in this via Hamas. What's your thoughts?
I think it's overwhelmingly likely that Iran directed this, overwhelmingly likely. So the Biden administration is saying they haven't seen a smoking gun, pure proof. That's fair enough, I suppose. But of course, they don't want it to be Iran because that would throw into relief the utter foolishness of their own policy of trying to have their own rapprochement with Iran. They haven't been enforcing the sanctions against Iran. They've allowed $6 billion of frozen Iranian money to be released in exchange for Iran releasing a number of American hostages. So if it's established that Iran directed this, the Biden administration would be very embarrassed. But the Wall Street Journal revealed clear meetings between senior Iranian officials and Hezbollah and Hamas in the lead up to this. The Israeli analyst Ehud Yari, the best of all the Middle East analysts, says that the Iranian Quds Force leader has been meeting with Hamas and Hezbollah leaders every fortnight in Lebanon for months. It's inconceivable that Hamas did this against Iran's wishes. And certainly Iran wanted to stop the Israeli-Saudi Arabia normalisation, because that would lead to a de facto alliance of the two biggest powers in the Middle East, apart from Iran itself, both of whom have a lot to fear from Iran and have a lot of interests in common. I'm sure that, gruesome and hideous as this is, Hamas wants a very big Israeli operation in Gaza. They may well then have an assurance that Hezbollah will attack Israel from the north, and we know that Hezbollah has about 150,000 rockets, which are more formidable than the Hamas rockets. And this is a very suitable scenario for Iran, because it gets to attack Israel on multiple fronts. Maybe Houthis will fire, Iran-sponsored Houthi rebels in Yemen will fire missiles at the southern Israeli port of Eilat. Islamic Jihad in the West Bank may attack. So Iran can orchestrate all this murder and mayhem against Israel while still having a level of deniability itself. The Americans have moved the aircraft carrier Gerald Ford into the Mediterranean, and they've told Iran, I think, in pretty straightforward terms, if you engage militarily yourselves against Israel, we'll engage with you. So the stakes and the dangers here are enormous. Israel may well have to fight a war on several fronts. It must destroy Hamas. It must keep its northern border secure, and it must protect its interests in the West Bank. And it has to do that all simultaneously with an army which is made up of reservists who are very competent, but, they're mainly office workers and regular folks and so on. They only serve in the military a couple of months a year. So this is an enormous, terrible challenge for Israel.
I've got to ask you, given we've got the Voice on the weekend, the Voice referendum vote, earlier in the debate, the Prime Minister and others said, we'll be seen very poorly around the world if this referendum is defeated. They say that on one hand, but you've got all these frontbenchers, Tony Burke and others, who have not called out the anti-Semitic hate we've seen spewing out on the streets of Sydney. And you've also got the situation where the police are impotent. The Premier took some time to get out there and deal with the situation in Sydney. And I think, to be fair, the Prime Minister himself has been very, very weak in his language broadly about Israel, but also specifically about these pro-Hamas rallies in Sydney. How do you see all of that playing out?
Well, I thought the situation on Monday night was a terrible disgrace, a shameful moment in Australian history. What the state authorities said was, you Jews who live in Sydney are not safe in this part of the city, Town Hall and not in the Opera House, and we're not going to guarantee your safety, and we're not going to try to guarantee your safety. We will, however, facilitate, in order to avoid violence, this march by extremists who end up shouting, F the Jews, gas the Jews, death to the Jews. Now, I give Chris Minns credit. The next day, he recognised the enormity of what had happened in Sydney, and he took control. And frankly, he's the only Labor politician in the entirety of this business who has looked like an adult, who looks like he has any understanding of what he's dealing with. The Albanese ministers and the other state government ministers, including Jacinta Allen in Victoria, it's as if, the only way they can conceive of international events is through ethnic branch stacking or something. They just seem to be completely out of their depth. It's not only that they absolutely lack moral clarity, that they absolutely lack moral courage, but they seem to have actually no idea of what, they're just so provincial. They just seem to have no idea of the forces that they're dealing with. And I think it's been a very poor performance at all levels from the Labor Party, except I'd say for Chris Minns after the first day.
It has been shameful. I look forward to more from you in the Australian, Greg. Your writing's been harrowing, but beautifully put. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, we'll be joined after the break by a Jewish Australian uni student who says right across the country they're doing it very tough on the campus. They said not just left-wing students, but also the academics as well. Plus our panel, the latest on The Voice. Welcome back. Let's go now inside the university campuses of Australia. We're often pretty tough on what's being taught and how students are reacting, but you'll be very proud of this next student standing up to what is occurring on campuses around the country. This week, anti-Israel material was being circulated across a number of our universities. In fact, yesterday, the University of Sydney Student Representative Council urged students to stand against the oppression until Palestine is free. That's a quote from them. And there was a flyer too distributed by the University of New South Wales Muslim Students Association, and it said that the Hamas attack was an attempt to reclaim Palestinian land. This is shameful stuff, but our students are confronted with this every day. Joining me now is one of those students, someone speaking out, Monash University student and Vice President of the Australasian Union of Jewish Students, Paris Ontum. Paris, great to have you on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Tell me not just how it's been in recent days, but just more broadly, we're told that there's an increase in anti-Semitism on student campuses. How have you found things?
On a personal level, I've been in the position recently to have to recount in a long list all of the different instances of anti-Semitism that I've faced in my 4 years at university. And it puts it into a perspective where, you know, that at the best of times at Monash Uni, which is the campus with the largest number of Jewish students on campus, it's still pretty bad.
And how's it been? You know, I guess this week there's been concerns probably about physical safety as well.
Definitely. At the moment, we're going through a campus-by-campus approach. So we've had some students tell us that things are good, it's business as usual, which is the quote that we're getting, but we don't expect it to stay that way. We are predicting that as public opinion changes to be less sympathetic towards Israel, that'll trickle down into campuses. And yeah, we're looking at how the campus situation was during the Second Intifada, which is the most recent comparable conflict. And it was bad. There was physical violence on campus.
Also, I guess you're making the point there that once Israel really does start to fight back, once the boots are on the ground in Gaza, there is a concern that that mood, which is not really with you now, is really going to come hard against you.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jewish students know it. They're very scared. We've had a really wide range of reactions from Jewish students, but I think underpinning all of them is fear and trepidation. And we've seen the way that the world responded to this. We've seen the way it's been felt in Sydney. We've seen the way that things have happened all over the world. And yeah, Jewish students are acutely aware of that.
Are the universities doing enough? Are you feeling supported by governments in the various, states where our universities are?
Yes, actually. I wasn't sure how it would unfold just because everything's happening so quickly, and some universities have taken a little bit longer than others, but I think that's normal given the nature of the situation. But yeah, we've had universities increasingly reach out to us as the union, as well as students on the ground, providing a range of support. We are advising universities very closely. They're listening to us. The main things that we're looking for are counselling that's trauma-informed and culturally sensitive for everyone who's impacted by this, safe entry and exit points. We don't need Jewish students being unable to get to their cars because they've got a protester screaming in their face. And
does that occur? Is it that sort of?
It occurs at the best of times. I know at Monash we have student groups who stand right next to the bus park. So anyone who's taken public transport or the Monash shuttle has a really hard time getting on campus without being harassed about any issue. And yes, it'll increase now.
What about academics? Reports today that there's a very significant pro-Palestine lobby in academia. How do you write a paper rightly, justifiably defending Israel's right to exist if it's going to land on the desk of someone who is responsible for a grade who's pro-Palestinian?
I've definitely been in that position. It's not an easy one to navigate, especially for us. The NTU, which is the Union for Academics, they endorse the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, which is an anti-Semitic movement. So this isn't at all surprising. As a student union, though, we're focusing on keeping students safe in classrooms and making sure that they know the procedures in their universities if they do need a paper remarked. That's what we can do.
Paris Ontum, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for giving us the human face tonight.
Thank you.
All right, after the break, New Zealand's election on the weekend. It looks like Labor will go under. Could it be the end of woke New Zealand? I hope so. And that horror poll for Victorian Liberals. Welcome back. Now, let this sink in for a moment. Israel, population of 9 million people, can call up 360,000 reservists within a couple of days, predominantly young people. Australia, we've got a population of around 26 million. We've only got 30,000 reservists. And given how so many young people feel about our country here, you've got to wonder if we could even call them up. But Israelis not only have joined the call, many are already on the front line against Hamas terrorists. It's extraordinary. Let's bring in my panel, Nick Cater from the Menzies Research Centre and John Roskin from the Institute of Public Affairs. John, I just think that's just such a stark position of where we are compared to where the Israelis are in love of country, a belief in themselves. And I've got to ask then, where have we gone wrong?
Well, Peter, we have taught an entire generation of young people to be ashamed of their country. And the Institute of Public Affairs did a poll of young Australians last year, and we found that amongst Australians aged 18 to 24, only 32% said they would fight for their country if we were attacked. 40% said they would not. These are consequences of an education system, of a cultural elite, of a media, of an academia that teaches young people to be ashamed of the country in which they live.
And Nick, you know, to all this talk about intergenerational trauma from James Cook and Arthur Phillip well over 2 centuries ago in this whole voice debate, yet the left won't acknowledge the intergenerational trauma that is real for Jewish people around the world. I mean, the Holocaust, I've met Holocaust survivors. I mean, it is in people's lived memory. And then you've got these pro-Hamas radicals. Many of them, they are Australian born and bred who were out there on Monday night at the Opera House.
You'd have to be profoundly ignorant of history and of geopolitics and of the situation in Israel for the last 40 years or so in order to come out and support Hamas. And yet we've seen that for large numbers of people and not just people, you know, of Middle Eastern origin, right? So the intelligentsia, once again, Peter, and they've done this frequently, as you know, they picked the wrong side. I mean, they did so. They went with the communists in Russia, a lot of them. They went with Mao Zedong in China. They went with, notoriously, with the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge was backed. You know, you'd get the same protests in favour of Khmer Rouge in university you do now. But the difference, Peter, is that in all those three examples, it was legitimate, arguably, to say you were ignorant of what was really happening on the ground because we didn't know what was happening inside Cambodia or during those times. But the thing is, now there is no excuse. They've seen it on their iPhones. They've seen the horrifying pictures coming out of violence towards women and children and terrorism. They've seen the body bags. How they could now stand up and say we're with the bad guys, it just beats me. It really does.
Let's go to that poll out from Resolve in Victoria. Now, this is fascinating, John. A support for the Liberal leader, John Pesutto, as preferred Premier, fallen 13% since the departure of Daniel Andrews. Now, a lot of people have thought, once Andrews goes, geez, we're back in the game, Liberals will jump to the front. They're not even competitive. Some of the pollsters say that Andrews was so disliked now that he's vacated the scene, you haven't got sort of that rub between Andrews and the voter, and they're giving Jacinta Allen a good look. But I tell you, that's got to worry Liberals, doesn't it?
Well, Peter, you've identified one of the misconceptions that Liberals here in Victoria have suffered under, which is that once Daniel Andrews goes, then people will flock back to the Liberal Party. Now, that was never going to happen, and this poll shows it's not happening. The other misconception that Victorian Liberals have is that Victoria is a left-wing state. I have never accepted this. It's an excuse for continued Liberal failure. And I think on Saturday, we may well see that a majority of Victorians have voted for the equality of all Australians and will vote no. Now, this is going to be a huge wake-up call. And even if the vote is close in Victoria, we are going to see in very safe Labor seats an overwhelming no majority. So I think the Liberals need to understand that the misconceptions they've suffered under could lead them into opposition for some time yet if they don't change their views.
lift their game. John, you're spot on. You are absolutely spot on. I will leave it there, gents. I'm out of time. I'm sorry. In with The Voice on Saturday night too. Of course, we've got a New Zealand election. Let's hope that's the end of woke New Zealand. Nick Cater, thank you. John Roscombe, thank you. I'll be back here tomorrow night, 6 o'clock, of course. Voice Referendum Eve here on Credlin. I'll see you then.